I have been around the block long enough to remember when a ticker tape could stop a city and when people literally slept on the street lines while the world tried to figure out what money was worth. I've seen bubbles bloom and rot, tulips that smelled like a joke, a 1929 summer that turned into a winter, the dot-com era when a company with no profits could sell dreams, and the housing mania that nearly took the system down. After all that, you'd think nothing could surprise me. Then along came crypto, and I will tell you plainly, it's worse than a rigged casino. Call it a bold claim, but hear me out. A casino is honest about what it is. The house sets the odds, the lights dazzle, and people walk in knowing the game. In a properly regulated casino, the worst you can say is that the game favors the house. Crypto pretends to be something else entirely, money, revolution, freedom, while operating like a casino that has secretly cut the deck and installed a separate back room where insiders are paid to win. It smells pretty, like perfume, but perfume does not give you air to breathe. Crypto is perfume pretending to be oxygen. If you want more straight talk about investing and why crazes matter, subscribe. I'll keep it blunt and practical. And a quick note before we go further. What follows is my opinion, not financial advice. History has a way of repeating its punchlines. People forget the script and then get to play their role again. Take tulip mania in the 1630s. The flower wasn't valuable because it produced anything useful. Value came from a story people told about value. A century or two later, the machine of modern finance learned new tricks, but the human players remained the same. In 1929, the tape ran hot and then cold. People bought into a narrative of endless prosperity. The dot-com bubble of the late 1990s dressed exuberance in code. .com at the end of a name implied immortality, even if there were no customers and no profits. In 2008, the housing market didn't collapse because roofs vanished. It collapsed because the promise of ever-rising prices trumped prudence and common sense. The pattern is obvious if you look for it. Novelty plus human weakness equals catastrophe. Technology changes, the inclinations it activates do not. A new gadget, a new protocol, a new way of telling a story, these are the props. Envy, greed, impatience, and the hunger for easy status are the actors. That is the reason history matters here. When a shiny thing appears, people always think this time is different. It rarely is. So what, in plain terms, must money be? It has three jobs. First, it must serve as a medium of exchange, something people accept in trade. Second, it must act as a unit of account, a way to measure value consistently so you can plan and make contracts. Third, it must preserve value sufficiently to be a store of purchasing power over time. Those jobs are not glamorous. They are boring, steady, and unimaginative.
They are the opposite of a headline. And for any instrument to claim the mantle of money, it must pass those basic tests in practice, not just in marketing. Crypto fails those tests spectacularly. A medium of exchange must be widely accepted and predictable. How many businesses price their goods in Bitcoin or smaller tokens on a routine basis? Acceptance is narrow and often imposed by speculators, not customers. A unit of account has to be reasonably stable. Volatility makes accounting impossible. A store of value must preserve purchasing power. When a token can swing 50% in a week, it's closer to a ticket in a lottery than to a reliable measure for savings. People do not wake up and say, "I'll buy groceries today in a currency that may be worth half tomorrow." They don't hedge their mortgage payments on that basis. Real money is dull because it must be useful. Speculation dresses up volatility and calls it excitement. You'll hear technical defenses, decentralized ledger, distributed consensus, trustless systems. These are engineering features, sometimes useful in narrow contexts. But engineering features do not automatically equal economic substance. A ledger that shows who owns what is not the same as a business that generates cash flows. A distributed database may be clever, yet if nobody who matters is willing to accept the token in exchange for labor, rent, food, or tools, its economic role is nil. The difference between technology and value is the difference between perfume and oxygen again. A nice smell does not keep you alive. Now look under the hood of this so-called great equalizer. At its heart is a mechanism that rewards insiders and promoters while inviting the public to provide the liquidity and the losses. New tokens are created out of thin air. Initial coin offerings sound noble until you realize they are fundraising events dressed as revolutions. Promoters mint a limited supply, build a story, and then sell some of that supply to early backers. Price rises, the story grows, retail investors pile in. When the moment is ripe, insiders sell. Rug pulls, pump and dumps, and exits are not outliers. They are built into the incentive structure. Picture a slot machine. You know the lights, the music, the tiny screen with a fake promise of jackpots. A rigged slot machine is worse. The machine sometimes gives a jackpot, while the proprietor takes the coins through a secret hatch. Crypto markets in practice have that secret hatch. Exchanges, the venues where tokens trade, shoulder much of the risk and also capture a great deal of the reward. They earn fees on every trade, they run custody services where your assets are supposed to be safe, and they sell products that concentrate power. When regulation is light and promoters are clever, the house can get very rich without doing anything that looks illegal on the surface. The players are familiar characters.
There's the young coder in a hoodie who speaks in million-dollar valuations as if scarcity were a technical achievement. There's the influencer with millions of followers who sells fame and a token in the same breath. There's the broker who benefits from the churn in accounts. Then there's the public, hard-working people with limited financial education who see headlines and FOMO, who hear a neighbor cashed out and think maybe the world changed for everyone at once. The Uber driver who tells you he bought into a coin at 20 cents and it's now $50. These are the stories that make rational people suspicious and irrational people greedy. It is important to consider incentives, because incentives explain behavior better than platitudes about free markets. Who benefits when a token's price explodes? Early insiders who sold. Who loses when it collapses? Late retail holders. Who profits in periods of extreme volatility? The platform owners and market makers who skim fees on every transaction. A casino has a clear beneficiary, the house. Crypto, in its real-world application, masks that beneficiary behind the glorious rhetoric of decentralization and liberation. This mismatch between rhetoric and reality is not merely embarrassing, it is structurally harmful. You may object, but some tokens have utility. Some protocols solve real problems. Utility is not a blanket defense of a market populated by speculation. If a protocol helps a specific technical problem, clearing a certain kind of transaction faster, or enabling a niche interoperability, fine. But most tokens people buy are not purchased to pay for specific services within a network. They are purchased as bets on price appreciation. Owning a token because you expect more buyers later is not investment. It is speculation dressed up in technology's clothes. Compare this to honest businesses. A soft drink company sells bottles, collects cash, pays employees, reinvests, and over decades compounds returns through sales to millions of people. A factory producing goods has customers and cash flows. Berkshire Hathaway buys companies that generate predictable free cash flow and sells them at a multiple that makes sense. Those are not exciting dinner table stories, but they are the building blocks of long-term wealth accumulation. They pass the basic test. Real assets produce real cash. Contrast that with a token whose value depends on the next buyer's optimism. One produces goods and services, the other produces headlines and losses for the unwise. Human psychology is the main engine of these cycles. Envy is cheap and contagious. When someone in the neighborhood seems to have gotten rich, people who have been careful, living below their means, saving for retirement, suddenly feel left behind. That's the beginning of trouble. Greed then takes the wheel. The promise of easy money is intoxicating.
Add impatience, the trait that makes people want payoff now rather than compounding over decades, and social reinforcement from likes, retweets, and celebrity endorsements, and you have the perfect recipe for a modern mania. There is a small moral point buried in all of this. Foolish actions are not merely personal mistakes. They are social failures when they erode the shared trust we have in money and markets. When the general populace starts to equate money with speculation, the norms that allow people to enter contracts, take loans, or plan for the future weaken. A society can survive individual bankruptcies, but when a large fraction of households bets the farm on stories rather than fundamentals, the fallout becomes collective. That's why this is not just about people losing money in private. The social cost is real. Now consider regulation, or the lack of it. Some governments reacted to crypto with decisive action. Others treated it as an experiment to be tolerated or even encouraged. That variance matters. When regulators are negligent, either out of ideology or ignorance, they leave a vacuum where predators and scammers flourish. When the state acts decisively to protect the monetary system, the game changes. I'm not endorsing authoritarian tactics. The point is that a functioning monetary order requires credible institutions. If you allow a free-for-all in which tokens become vehicles for laundering hype into riches for insiders, you should not be surprised when ordinary people are left holding worthless claims. Ask yourself a simple question. Who gains when a token goes up, and who loses when it goes down? If the answers point to insiders and the public in that order, you are looking at a rigged table. If the purported goal is decentralization and democratization of finance, then why are centralized exchanges, venture-backed groups, and anonymous founders extracting so much of the value? This dissonance between promise and reality is central to the critique. There are clever metaphors to help this sink in. Think of crypto as a perfume factory. It smells great. Marketers place it in beautiful bottles and tell you it's the essence of freedom. But perfume doesn't feed you. Real wealth is not aroma. It is the steady accumulation of purchasing power, the dividends that come from productive enterprises, the rent that comes from owning a business that people need. Those things are boring, and for that reason they are undervalued in a culture that prizes flash and narrative. Yet they are what builds multi-generational capital. You'll hear defenders of crypto who argue that volatility is merely a phase and that adoption will smooth prices. Perhaps, but volatility is not a trivial affliction. It scuttles the unit of account function, undermines the medium of exchange role, and destroys the store of value promise. Banks do not lend on assets that swing wildly. Prudent financial managers avoid collateral that can evaporate overnight. If a token can't be relied upon to hold even a fraction of its value, it cannot perform the duties of money in any useful mainstream sense. There is also the matter of leverage. Casinos tempt people to play beyond their means with credit and loans. Crypto markets have done the same, often more dangerously. Margin products, derivatives, leverage tokens, these are instruments built for the mathematically literate, but used by the emotionally charged. Borrowing to speculate is a recipe for ruin. History is full of households ruined by the seductive belief that one more trade will fix everything. The 2008 housing crisis showed us the structural danger when leverage and poor underwriting meet exuberant belief. Crypto recreates that recipe with fewer guardrails and less accountability. We must also talk about the perverse social signal that mass speculation sends. When prominent institutions or celebrities shill a token, they confer legitimacy on a product that may have no intrinsic usefulness. Social proof is powerful. If a movie star or a kid with 1 million followers tweets about a coin, millions see a signal. This is the place to be. Herds are not softly behaving creatures. When they stampede, they trample everything in their path. That is not a metaphor that glorifies capitalism. It is a cautionary note about human nature masquerading as market wisdom. Let me be clear. I am not saying every use of blockchain technology is worthless. Distributed ledgers can solve some technical problems. There are research projects and niche business models that may benefit from tokenization in narrow contexts. But the mainstream narrative that tokens broadly are a superior form of money and an inevitable upgrade to the monetary system rests on an implausible bridge built from wishful thinking, questionable incentives, and mass psychology. In practice, what we get is organized speculation with new toys. At the center of my criticism is a simple moral and practical rule: avoid stupidity. If you strip away the marketing and the jargon, you can test every investment idea with a handful of plain questions. Does it produce cash? Does it have sustainable customers? Will it still be useful in 10 years? Who benefits when prices rise, and who collects the losses when prices fall? If you can answer those questions in favor of the asset, you have something that resembles investment. If your only answer is supply is limited, it's decentralized, or the next buyer will pay more, you are participating in a speculative contest, not building wealth.
This rule is not a moralistic scolding, it is pragmatic. The world does not reward cleverness in the same way it rewards patience and honesty. Compounding is the most powerful force in finance for a reason. Small, steady edges applied over long periods create enormous results. That is the boring path, the one without headlines and without the Instagram glamour, but it's the path that works.
Think about Coca-Cola selling soda for a century, or a factory producing a staple good people will buy regardless of fads. These are companies that earn money from customers, reinvest profits, pay workers, and create durable value. They are the antithesis of the speculative token, whose worth depends on momentum and marketing. If you own productive assets, your returns are tied to real economic activity. If you own tokens, your returns are often tied to narrative velocity. One is constructive, the other is parasitic. There is also the ethical dimension. Fraud, deception, and outright theft flourish where incentives are misaligned and regulation is lax. I have seen people trot out elaborate stories about disintermediation and financial sovereignty while quietly selling to insiders and setting up structures that let them disappear with the money. Those are not just clever tactics, they are abuses of trust. Markets function when participants can trust that claims have underlying substance. When that trust erodes, markets become quarantine zones for predators. Now, with all of that on the table, consider the social cost. Households that lose retirement savings, young people who borrow to chase stories, communities decimated by speculative ruin. These are not abstract casualties. They are real people whose lives are altered by a mania. The public interest in preventing mass harm is not a partisan matter. It is common sense. When a sophisticated few design a game that fosters mass self-deception, shirking institutional responsibility should not be a virtue. But you might say, regulation will ruin innovation. That is a false dichotomy. Sensible rules that protect consumers and provide transparency do not preclude technological progress. What they do is make markets honest. You can innovate and still enforce basic guardrails, require proper disclosures, limit leverage for retail investors, ensure exchanges keep proper custody, and prosecute malicious fraud. Those are not assaults on liberty. They are essentials of functioning markets. Here is the tension I want you to feel. The story of crypto is sold as liberation from intermediaries and as a way to put power in the hands of the many. In practice, the power concentrates in a few hands very quickly, and the many are left to chase the echo of the story. The technology enables new kinds of value transfer, true, but the social reality has been that promoters and insiders extract disproportionate gains. That combination, the promise of freedom, the reality of extraction, is what makes crypto worse than a rigged casino. At least in a rigged casino, you know where the house is. In crypto, the house is hidden by slogans. We've walked through the negatives: failed monetary functions, structural incentives favoring insiders, psychological traps, regulatory neglect, and social harm. Yet the argument becomes even sharper when you contrast it with the alternative. Real investing is not glamorous.
It involves discipline, patience, and a long view. It rewards those who resist the seductive calls of the crowd. The difference between the man who buys a durable business and the man who buys a token is not luck. It is a fundamentally different orientation toward reality. Ask yourself, would you rather own part of a company that sells a product millions of people buy every day, coffee, soap, insurance, or a digital token whose price depends on the next speculative round? Owning productive assets anchors you in the real economy. Owning pure speculation anchors you in the next headline. That distinction is moral as well as financial. One builds community and employment, the other redistributes wealth to those skilled at telling stories. I am often asked whether this is simply sour grapes from an older generation. That is a cheap dismissal. The critique is not about resisting change, it is about recognizing the difference between genuine innovation and repackaged gambling. It is possible to admire technological advances without abandoning prudence. The proper attitude is wary curiosity. Look closely, ask who benefits, demand transparency, and keep your own house in order. Now, before we go further into the anatomy of the actors and the ways they rig the game, pause and imagine a simple scenario. You have an idea. This token will be used by thousands in 5 years. Fine. Who builds the product? Who pays for marketing today? Who takes the early risk?
If early insiders are selling while claiming to build, what does that tell you? And most importantly, who will buy from you when the story fades? In many projects, the buyers are the ones who have not yet made up their minds. Their purchases are a hope, not a utility. Hope is not a business model. If you take nothing else from this, remember that stories are cheap and incentives are revealing. A narrative that promises egalitarian wealth but funnels the proceeds to a few is not a revolution. It is a transfer mechanism disguised as emancipation. That is the core moral outrage. The rhetoric is noble. The practice is often mercenary. We could stop here and already have a convincing case that crypto, in its current mass market form, is a modern carnival of illusions. But the story is richer and uglier when you look at the specific mechanics by which the game is operationalized. Promoters build scarcity myths, exchanges monetize churn, founders create tokens with embedded advantages for early holders, community managers fan the flames. Then, when the temperature is perfect, insiders cash out. The public, infatuated with the dream, loses. You see the exact same choreography in 1999 with dotcoms and in 2007 with mortgage-backed securities, a story, an enabling infrastructure, and a tale of casualties. This is where the comparison to a rigged casino becomes more than metaphor. A rigged casino changes the payoff structure so that the house wins even when luck appears to favor the player.
Crypto, in its institutional reality, fashions incentives so that early movers, insiders, and intermediaries capture outsized returns, while the latecomers shoulder the downside. It is game design with moral consequences. The more I look at the market structures, the clearer it becomes that the danger is not only individual foolishness, but system design. When a system is engineered to reward extraction under a veil of decentralization, it will produce extraction. The ethical and economic solution is straightforward, even if politically sensitive. Align incentives with productive outcomes and create transparency so that the many are not surprised by the few. At this point, you might be braced for a list of villains and schemes: the rug pull, the pump and dump, the exchange that runs fractional custody. Those are all real and instructive. But more illuminating than cataloging scams is understanding the psychology that allows them to flourish. The appetite for quick glory, the social proof of seeing peers get rich, and the cultural status that comes with being first. Once you see that pattern, you can spot it elsewhere. Remember 1999, swap internet for token, and the script is eerily the same. So far, we've mapped the terrain: historical precedents, the failure of crypto to meet money's basic functions, the rigging mechanisms, the players, and the human tendencies that fuel the whole apparatus. That gives us a strong case that crypto is not merely another speculative market. It is a systemic problem dressed in novelty. But the argument is not fully made until you compare outcomes: who builds enduring wealth and who experiences headline riches that melt away. We will return to that comparison in greater detail, examining specific behaviors and the practical checklist you should use to separate investment from speculation. For now, keep the two images with you: perfume versus oxygen, and a slot machine with a secret hatch. Both are vivid and both point to the same conclusion. If your financial life is built around smoke and mirrors, you have chosen spectacle over substance. Hold that image. It will sharpen the questions you ask when the next flashy token arrives at your feed. Hold that image. It will sharpen the questions you ask when the next flashy token arrives at your feed. Now, let's get practical. If you want to separate an honest business from a story-driven gamble, you need a checklist you can hold in your hands and read without getting wooed by the lights. The checklist is simple because sensible things are usually simple. First question: does it produce cash? Real companies sell products or services to customers who pay them money. That cash shows up in bank accounts. It's real. Tokens generally do not produce cash for holders. At best, some tokens entitle holders to fees or revenue streams inside a protocol, but the vast majority of tokens traded on exchanges are not priced by future cash flows.
They are priced by hope, the hope that a new buyer will pay more tomorrow. Hope is not an income statement. Second, does it have customers who pay repeatedly for a useful thing? Coffee shops, insurance companies, and bottling plants serve millions of customers every day. That relationship is durable because it solves real problems. A token that's useful only within an app that nobody uses is a marketing problem, not an investment. Ask for evidence: who uses it, how many transactions, what fees are actually paid with the token, and is that usage growing because of utility or because of speculation? Third, what do the people in charge actually own and when do they sell?
In honest businesses, founders and early investors often hold for a long time, and their incentives are tied to the firm's success. In token projects, founders frequently allocate themselves large fractions of the supply, then announce locking periods that evaporate faster than promised. Early selling, insiders taking chips off the table while the crowd is just getting warmed up, is the clearest red flag. Fourth, is there a sensible legal and accounting structure? Companies publish audited financials, register with authorities, and can be held responsible in court. Tokens float in a gray sea. Are there audited audits? Who holds custody of the assets? Where is the corporate entity domiciled and under what law? When answers are fuzzy or legal structures are deliberately opaque, you are looking at a product designed to avoid scrutiny. Fifth, where do the fees go? Exchanges skim fees on every trade. Market makers and custodians take slices. If the profit flows mostly to intermediaries rather than to productive activity, you are watching rent-seeking, not growth. A healthy system directs value to productive participants. A parasitic system concentrates gain with those who control the plumbing. Sixth, what role does leverage play? If a product invites retail customers to borrow to buy it, or offers exotic leverage tokens, treat that as a danger sign. Leverage speculation magnifies losses and turns temporary price noise into permanent ruin for the unwary. The 2008 housing crisis taught us about leverage and mispriced risk. Crypto has reproduced the temptation to borrow against hope. If most of your checklist answers point to no, then you are not investing. You are participating in a speculative contest whose rules favor those who set them. That contest may be entertaining, and some people will get rich. Many more will be left to convince themselves the market was unfair. That is how these things end, again and again. Let me illustrate the choreography with a fictional but typical sequence you will see repeatedly. A small team issues a token and announces a revolutionary use case, smoothing fees, decentralizing a market, whatever sounds noble. They stage a fair launch narrative. No VC, no insiders, just community.
Behind the scenes, there are private allocations and venture rounds propping up the price. Influencers hype. Exchanges add the token and the volume spikes. Retail comes in. When price triples, founders sell a tranche and venture investors exit with handsome gains. The community writes think pieces about distribution and network effects, but the economic reality is that the founders monetized a story built on thin foundations. When adoption stalls and narrative momentum fades, price collapses. The built-in advantages for early holders remain. The latecomers bear the losses. That pattern is not an accident. It is design. Promoters know that human beings respond to narratives. They know social proof and FOMO work better than product-market fit. It is less expensive to fabricate a story and fund a marketing push than to build a durable business with real customers and steady cash flows. The reward in the short run is big money. The cost for the many is ruin. Now, turn to the question of the intermediaries, the houses that rake in fees. Exchanges are not charities. They profit when markets churn. When fees are the business model, you get design incentives to encourage churn. Products get gamified. Short time horizons are rewarded. Liquidity is manufactured. Markets that should be places to price risk become entertainment venues. The metaphor of a casino is fair, but incomplete. A conventional casino is explicit about its edge. You see it on the rules. Crypto marketplaces hide the edge behind slogans of decentralization and democratization. A rigged casino is worse than a simple casino because you don't even know which side of the glass is the house. In crypto, the house is often disguised as a community, a foundation, or an anonymous team. Let us consider stablecoins for a moment because they are often presented as the practical bridge between crypto and money. A stablecoin that is truly backed by reserves held transparently and audited could serve as a useful tool. But not all stablecoins are created equal. Some are backed by a basket of real assets and audited regularly. Others rely on promises, algorithms, collateral chains, or opaque reserves that are fragile under stress. Algorithmic stablecoins that depend on market confidence to stay pegged are particularly precarious. When confidence fails, peg breaks, and the supposed stability collapses like a house of cards. That fragility is a reminder. Not everything labeled stable is safe. We should also discuss the political and institutional dimension without turning this into an argument about regimes. Some countries acted quickly, not because they loved technology, but because they recognized a systemic risk when it looked obvious. Others treated crypto as a playground for innovation and allowed things to fester.
Both approaches have consequences. A country that tolerates opaque offerings and weak enforcement becomes a magnet for fraud.
A country that clamps down too hard can stunt legitimate technical work. The point is not to advocate censorship or to glorify authoritarian efficiency. The point is that credible institutions and consistent rules limit the ability of predators to exploit goodwill and ignorance. When regulatory frameworks are absent or inconsistent, bad actors exploit the vacuum and the public pays the price. People frequently point to the few spectacular winners and use those stories as proof of a new paradigm. The problem with celebrity winners is that they are survivorship bias incarnate. You only see the people who made it, not the thousands who lost. Telling the story of those winners without the context of the losers is a moral hazard. It encourages risky behavior and normalizing gambling as financial strategy. Think about it the other way. Would you advise your grandchild to learn to build businesses or to chase headlines? Which path produces lasting wealth and which produces a headline on a Tuesday? There is one more vector of harm that deserves emphasis: the way crypto reshapes social norms around money. When ordinary conversations about saving, mortgages, pensions, and wages are contaminated by the mindset that every asset is a ticket to instant wealth, society pays a long-term cost. Contracts assume a shared understanding of value. Wages are negotiated based on reasonable expectations, and pensions are built on predictability. Mass speculation erodes these norms. People start treating their life savings as entertainment. Lending institutions have to respond to new risks. Employers and policymakers face higher volatility in household finances. Those spillovers matter. Financial crises are not just sharp market losses, they change people's futures. At this point, you might object that the solution is education, not prohibition. Education is necessary, but alone it is not sufficient. Education without rules is like teaching children to swim while leaving them in a riptide. You need both: strong, simple education around basic financial principles and rules that prevent the most exploitative structures from proliferating unchecked. Reasonable disclosure requirements, limits on leverage for retail accounts, proper custody standards for custodians. These are not anti-innovation, they are pro-market integrity. So what should a prudent person do? Short and plain, learn the difference between investment and speculation and act accordingly. Keep your horizon long. Favor assets that produce cash. Avoid borrowing to chase a story. Resist social proof. When a neighbor shows you their gains, ask whether they realize them, whether they pay taxes, and whether they would buy the asset if its price dropped by half tomorrow. If the answer is no, your instincts should be on alert. A practical portfolio rule is useful.
Allocate the majority of your savings to productive assets, diversified businesses, broad market funds, bonds appropriate to your age and risk tolerance, real assets that generate income. If you must play, do it with money you can afford to lose, not with money you need for rent, healthcare, or retirement. Treat speculative positions as entertainment. If you cannot say exactly why you own a token in terms of cash flow or utility, you are guessing. There is also a posture to adopt in discourse. When you hear the language of destiny and inevitability, this will replace national currencies, this will unbank the banks, this is unstoppable. Be skeptical. Grand narratives have their place, but they are poor substitutes for evidence of value creation. Demand clarity. Ask the hard questions. Who exactly benefits from the success of this project? What happens if adoption stalls? Who bears legal responsibility? If the answers are evasive, move on. Now a few words about temperament. Speculation rewards short-term bravado. Investing rewards temperament, patience, humility, and a willingness to admit error. The market will provide feedback in the form of losses when you are wrong, but the wise use those losses as painful lessons rather than excuses to double down. Avoid the trap of revenge trading, trying to recoup losses quickly because your pride is wounded. That's a gambler's impulse, not an investor's discipline. Let's return to a moral note, because this is not merely a technical critique. When an industry grows by profiting from other people's naivete, that is a moral failure. Stories that glorify outsized returns while hiding structural extraction are ethically suspect. Promoters who frame wealth transfer as liberation are engaging in rhetorical sleight of hand.
If you build your career on engineering narratives that move mass sentiment and take a cut while others lose, you are not playing in the spirit of markets that serve the common good. You are building a modern rentier scheme dressed as liberation. I'll be blunt. Some of this is about temperament, and some of it is about ethics. Avoid stupidity. Do not let eagerness for status or quick money substitute for rational evaluation. When the world offers you perfume and calls it oxygen, refuse to hold your breath. The long-term advantages of thrift and steady compounding are boring, precisely because they are stable, reliable, and unglamorous. Those unglamorous techniques, saving consistently, buying durable businesses, reinvesting dividends, avoiding leverage, produce security and intergenerational capital. They are the antidote to the spectacle economy. You might ask if I'm against all technological change. That would be silly. Technology advances and sometimes creates new, durable economic opportunities. But technology does not automatically translate into economic value for token holders.
There is a distinction between solving a technical problem and creating an asset class that is widely usable as money. The former can be valuable. The latter requires sound economics, legal clarity, and social adoption. Without those, tokens are more akin to collectibles inflated by hype. We live in a time when narratives travel faster than verification. Social media amplifies stories and shortens attention spans. That environment creates the perfect breeding ground for speculative manias. It also creates an opportunity for responsible voices to push back. If you care about the future of markets and the integrity of financial life, speak plainly when you see distortions. Call out opaque structures, demand audits, and insist on transparency. Markets policed by informed participants are healthier than markets policed by rumor and hype. Before I close, let me give you 3 test questions to carry with you the next time a new token arrives at your feed. First, who pays cash to this venture, and for what? Second, if the price fell by 80% tomorrow, would the project still be building something useful, or would it be dead? Third, who benefits if this thing goes up, and who suffers if it goes down? If those questions leave you with more doubts than confidence, you know what to do. We have gone through the anatomy of the beast, the psychology that fuels it, the institutional failures that let it flourish, and the alternatives that actually build wealth. The conclusion is uncompromising. Crypto, in its current mass market form, is worse than a rigged casino. At least in a rigged casino, you can point to the house and know who is getting rich. In the crypto spectacle, the house hides behind noble words, the rules shift to advantage insiders, and the public is invited to gamble their savings on narratives. So here is the final practical prescription. Repeat it like a mantra. Avoid stupidity. Live below your means. Favor businesses that produce cash and have paying customers. Don't borrow to speculate. Ask honest questions about incentives and ownership. Treat speculative rumors as entertainment unless you can validate them against hard economic tests. If you want excitement, buy a ticket to Vegas. If you want wealth, be boring.
Echoing the bluntness people have heard from voices like Charlie Munger, the world does not reward fashion. It rewards sound economics practiced consistently. That is not a conservative refusal to change. It is a defense of prudence in the face of well-packaged illusions. If you prefer steady compounding to short-lived thrills, like and subscribe. There's more sober investment thinking where this came from. For links to reading and a simple checklist you can download, check the description below. This commentary is an opinion, not financial advice. Make your own decisions, do your homework, and consult a qualified professional before making major financial moves. Avoid stupidity.